Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we got the new surprise album from Taylor Swift, Evermore. But okay, for real, I wasn't as surprised by this as it seems like a lot of folks were. Because one thing I cannot fault Taylor Swift for is her work ethic. Not only did she write and release Folklore this year, but she was also starting work on re-recording her previous albums under Big Machine so that she could regain some rights to them under Republic. But I also had the niggling feeling that after Folklore sold way better than I and any label executive likely predicted, that there would be a follow-up. Apparently in the low-key year of 2020, folks didn't mind traipsing through her atmospheric, obviously indie rock inspired folk adventure, which despite its notable flaws did have a surprising amount of staying power for me, to the point where a song or two might wind up on a certain list of my favorite tracks of 2020. Stay tuned, you'll find out. But I did not expect the follow-up would come in late 2020, complete with the obvious indie cosigns that now included the rest of the National and Haim as perhaps the most obvious collaborators for Taylor Swift that are possible. But it did make sense, given that Taylor Swift is now on Republic. She probably got access to the true sales margins behind Ariana Grande's Thank You Next sales run, and with limited competition outside of the holiday music and her known practice of imitating Beyonce, I mean, it's no surprise that she did the surprise drop in December. Hell, even in Q4, just solid business. The question would be whether or not this could hold up as a self-contained entity as strong as Folklore, especially minus the surprise factor, or whether or not just be an extended list of B-sides granted album status because Taylor Swift just has that level of clout. Now, even if it was, I doubt the fans would even admit it, but I'll admit I was a little conflicted on whether or not this would work. Again, she does not have the factor of surprise. The success of Folklore takes away some of the riskier stakes that came with the indie pivot, and it made it hard for me to ascertain how much to expect. But alright, I just know this review is going to run long, so let's get to it. How was Evermore? Well, let me just say this. It feels weird to compare Evermore with Folklore, at least to me. Yeah, there's overlap in producers and guest collaborators and some of the content, and it's getting marketed as a sister album, but overall the texture and feel of Evermore doesn't really remind me of its immediate predecessor, but an album that's much older, of which I've got a lot of contentious opinions. 2012's Red. And it's those contentious opinions that convinced me I had to make this a full review when I could have easily put it on the pulse saying that while it might be more consistent than Folklore, its highs are not as great, there are more questionable production and writing choices, it's awkwardly sequenced, it still runs too long, and while there are steps back towards country, of which I'm a fan, it leaves the album in a distinctly transitory and uncertain place that Folklore just didn't quite inhabit to the same degree. I'm not gonna say it's just B-sides of the last album, tempted as though I might be, but it did leave me in a deeply uncertain place that throughout the course of this review, we're gonna try to parse through, have me come to some sort of emotional conclusion, but I'm also saying all this given my pretty contentious views on Red, so let's deal with that now. It's her pop breakthrough that her fans less tolerant of country consider this her best album instead of Speak Now, but for me back in 2012, I considered it a pretty severe drop-off in quality across the board, especially with some painfully dated pop production and writing that didn't maintain the high standards that she had previously set. Coupled with a run of singles that I actively disliked at the time, I actually did review the album on my blog way back in 2012, and it was framed as an open letter to Taylor Swift written at a very raw time in my life, and man, that review is not aged well. It's moralistic, hyperbolic, really damn messy. But there are a few points that actually hold true to this day. In shifting from relatable girl next door to pop icon, there is some tonal dissonance between the big pop swings and the more intimate songs that only seem to reinforce some of the calculated elements of her persona, especially the direct references to a lot of her personal life. And for the record, this is still something that came to mind for her 2020 albums. Plus, it was also clear she hadn't quite worked out where she was going to take this pop, country, folk fusion yet, seeming to bend a little bit more to her collaborators' tones than her own, regardless of genre. And hell, that's kind of true in 2020 as well. But let's be real, real, in 2012 I also thought that Speak Now was a step down from Fearless, and I hadn't quite come to appreciate the tighter specifics and the more honest punch of her writing. But hell, when I came to that realization, I wound up liking Red even less, because it felt like an artistic regression, or even selling out for as much as any multi-millionaire artist even could. A path that she would continue on for 2 more world-conquering albums. But alright, why bring up any of this? Well, as much as the content of Evermore feels like the natural continuation coming off of Folklore, the overall sound of this album feels like it could slot alongside the slower country folk songs of Red, or at least there could be a progression into that sound if you want to imagine it. Hell, if you're familiar with the prevalent sounds of early 2010s indie rock, maybe slap on a little bit more reverb and most of these instrumentals could have fit in just fine between 2011 and 2014, even with these exact same collaborators at that time. So it almost feels like it's out of an alternate timeline where Taylor Swift meant indie right after Speak Now, especially with the more prominent and warmer acoustic country touches that were hinted back on Betty, but are considerably more prevalent here on cuts like Dorothea or Cowboy Like Me. Now, Aaron Dessner of The National took a much more hands-on role this time around in production, with Jack Antonoff only having production credits on Gold Rush, and while that did lead to the organic tones getting much more prominent, with warmer guitars, a more supple set of bass lines, and even the keyboards having a little bit more body, I do think there were some subtle electronic touches and swell that Jack Antonoff helped integrate that this album could have used to accentuate a lot of the bigger moments. Yeah, Aaron Dessner has touches of it in the arrangement with the subtle patterns of percussion imported from late period in National, along with some clattering shoved into Closure that does not fit at all, arguably makes it the weakest song here. And you could argue that it is better blended than Jack Antonoff would have brought to the table, but I'd also argue some of those fractures in the blending added some hints of instability and genuine darkness that this album tempers to the extent of the sharper drama. And this is on the album where Taylor Swift works with Haim on a murder ballad that I really wish had picked up a little bit more of that southern gothic atmosphere. Taylor Swift has proven capable of it, and I don't know why it's not here. Now, granted, I'm not really wild about any of the collaborations here. Bon Iver got back into his auto-tune falsetto bag on the closing title track, which doesn't compliment Taylor Swift at all. And Matt Berringer on the Coney Island, you know, the writing and the interplay pushes it into greatness, but the chemistry just isn't quite there to put this up among with Exile, and it really should have been. I had high expectations there. But again, the writing is where I pay the most attention to any Taylor Swift album. Where she's following in the lane of folklore, she's embracing less autobiography and more fictional narratives, where she's building off of old, conflicted relationship drama with a lot of unspoken history and an impressive eye for emotional nuance and detail for both the men and women involved. Indeed, I think the more that Taylor Swift has leaned into her wilder outcast side of her writing, especially in the balance with the more prim and tasteful arrangements, the more impact she's been able to leverage on a lot of these songs. It's why the spare piano ballad Champagne Problems is such an early gut punch, and her abandoning the boyfriend that was on the cusp of proposing but never seemed to truly get her, or the back and forth of 'Tis the Damn Season and Dorothea about the girl who chased dreams in Hollywood but never quite stirred her soul to the same extent versus the guy that she left behind who holds that key to her heart. Or even the con artist in love song of Cowboy Like Me, where their unique wiles lend them a very special but also very modern chemistry. And when you balance that out with the agonizingly sad Tolerate It about a distant and more experienced lover who withholds affection from her and she wonders what it would be like to leave, to the implied fractured relationships of Coney Island and Happiness, there is some real maturity and dimensionality to the vulnerability and scenes that Taylor Swift is painting, where the callback to her grandmother, Marjorie, makes a lot of sense in framing that distinctly feminine balance. But let's be real. These are notes that Taylor Swift has hit before, and the slightly milder tone overall not only reminds me of Red and feeling like the stakes have lessened a little bit, but it leaves me wishing for more development or intricacy in her storytelling outside of those themes, or maybe even drilling a little bit deeper. I mean, I gotta be blunt, you can tell Taylor Swift's greatest frustration on this album is coming from how quickly passion can overwhelm her, and while that works on Gold Rush because she states it pretty plainly, it does fall a bit flat flat on Willow and Ivy because it's missing that next step into examining why. More frustrating still is Long Story Short, which contains a lot of veiled references to old drama and how this is their step to move past it, ultimately a theme that's encapsulated on the title track as well, but without the same cutting detail, it just does not stick in the same way. It's got all the same chipper elements that was all over Red and the worst parts of Lover. It crops up a couple times here too, and just does not have the same deeper impact for me. And outside of Evermore being an okay conclusion, the sequencing can make this both a front-loaded and oddly jumbled experience, and there's nothing in the deep cuts that hits me as hard as This Is Me Trying, or really any of the best songs on Folklore. But then the more I thought about it, the more I realized why this album reminding me so much of Red bugged me as deeply as it did. Because for Taylor Swift, this is a homecoming album. As much as she's described going further into the wilderness with her sound, there's really nothing in the writing or production that really convinces me of that so much as a return to what she is known, just in a slightly different form. She's older, a little rougher around the edges for the better, likely even wiser, but this is also back for her in a comfort zone, where you can tell that there's more allure than ever for her to become the every woman again, but that's also not really who she is in the most powerful moments here. The best parts of Folklore understood that. It let her add glamour and mystique to that love triangle that's more fictional. To write The Last Great American Dynasty feeling a kinship for the woman who broke it all down, who ruined everything. And at her most painful moments on This Is Me Trying, the weight of the song came from balancing who she is in reality with the vulnerability we all share. But here, all the relatable emotionality, it's there, and we get how a larger-than-life presence like her can cause such tumult in people's lives, but that's not really how she wants to consider herself. And as much as her fictional narratives highlight the drama of those fractured stories, she's purposefully not aiming that high or far on Evermore. And that creates some of that weird dissonance for me. As you can tell, she's clearly trying to create a more normal or down-to-earth album. You can tell she wants to close doors behind her on her past, maybe settle down, get married, have kids, and I would not be surprised if that happens for her in the very near future in real life. But I'm also reminded of Jason Isbell's Something More Than Free, how he literally tried to slam the same sort of doors behind his past, only for a few years later the Nashville Sound to be released, and highlighting how you aren't really escaping those deeper truths that hold about yourself and your artistic identity. And as it is, it leaves me still feeling very conflicted on Evermore. Again, individual moments are great, and outside of Willow, the opening third of the album is excellent. It's more scattered from there, but it is, again, more consistent enough in what it wants to be. I just wish that clicked with me more deeply. It doesn't have the highest moments of her best work. I would not put it above Speak Now, Folklore, or even the best parts of Lover, but I also think those who are looking for the more grounded connection for Taylor Swift that she did display on parts of Red, they will adore this album. They might even like it more than Folklore long term. So that being said, 7 out of 10, still recommended. It's definitely a good album, not a great one, and while it's transitional, I gotta be honest, I'm not nearly as excited to where she's gonna take this from here. I hate to say it, but maybe if she wants to settle down for a bit, it'll be good for everyone involved, and I'm not gonna deny her that, so yeah. I think she found some peace with this. I respect that, so if you're curious and you want to find that for yourself, especially around this season, give it a chance. Check it out. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. I'm sure I said some things, particularly surrounding Red, that will be controversial. I know all of my opinions around that album have been controversial. Again, I went back to it before this album. It still does not really work for me. I think some people love it a lot more than I do, but that pop country fusion, the way she does it, I don't think flatters her to the same degree, especially not in the writing department, and especially coming off of Speak Now. But again, that's my opinion. I know that people are pretty deeply divided on what her best material is, and I know I'm outside the norm when it comes to what a lot of Swifties actually love about her catalog, so I've accepted that. Beyond that, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. And if you guys want to get an album on my schedule, well, you can't before the end of the year. I'm actually working flat out on that. But hey, if you want to start helping support the channel anyway, or potentially in the near future when you can add albums to my schedule for 2021, link to my Patreon right over there. Again, please don't feel any obligation to do so. It's tough times for everybody right now, and again, don't feel any obligated. I will be fine, but if you want to get involved, there's the option. But until then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.